Hello, class, and welcome back as we've now reached the grand finale of our chapter on the Cold War spanning several decades. Please title your notes for today Tensions Thaw. So, as you well know by now, the Cold War era really is defined by these frozen tensions between um, once allies, the United States and the Soviet Union, then turned enemies during this period of tumultuousness between the ideas of capitalism and communism, Americanism and Russianism. So, in today's lesson, we'll really talk about the thawing of those tensions, how they started to melt away, and really pave the way toward relations between the US and Russia now. Before we do that, I just want to quickly recap some of the different regions that we visited over the course of this chapter. In your future coursework, you'll go into a lot more detail and you'll visit some of the other Cold War hotspots as well. But we started by talking about the growth of the Iron Curtain, the division of Germany, the US policy of containment, and ultimately the Marshall Plan. The US giving money to European countries to prevent them from falling to communism, places like Greece and Turkey. We talked about the Korean War and the US supporting the South Koreans, trying to prevent the encroachment of China and the Soviet Union onto the Korean Peninsula. We talked about the confrontation in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, after the US placed an embargo on the island and the Soviet Union started positioning missiles really close to the US border. And finally, we talked about the Vietnam War, the clash between the United States and the North Vietnamese over the issue of communism, ultimately leading to the US withdrawing and communism taking over the region anyway. So at this point, we're going to talk about a transition in power. The new Soviet leader is a man named Brezhnev. We're only going to talk about him briefly. Again, when you get to US history too, you'll really explore the different Soviet premiers in more detail. This is merely an overview. So if you can go into next year and the year after with just a basic understanding of who these people are and what these different policies are, you'll be in really good shape. So in terms of the US presidency, where we are at this point is still with Richard Nixon. Okay? You'll see that we're going to jump around quite a bit today. So Nixon is going to call for what's called a détente. A détente is basically like an easing of tensions. It's nothing formal. It's not an alliance, but basically it's like a period of trying to cooperate and like move to better territory. Kind of think of like a continuation of the kitchen debates where you're trying to like symbolically come together, symbolically shed that kind of like uneasiness between the two different countries. So he meets with Brezhnev in 1972, and there they call for a series of talks called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, aka SALT. No, not SALT, SALT. A 5-year agreement, basically, that sets a limit on the number of ICBMs that a country can possess. So you'll see that this is really important. Think of those charts and graphs that you've seen in this chapter about the intense buildup of nuclear weaponry. This is trying to set a cap on it, again, trying to ease tensions, move us closer to world peace. Here's the issue. At the same time, things are going to start going down in Afghanistan. So after the Second World War, many pockets of the Middle East, specifically Afghanistan, fell to communism. Rebels in the region were not particularly happy about this, most notably the Mujahideen, who again, in future classes, you'll explore in a lot more detail, but their goal here is to overthrow the communist government. Sound familiar? Sounds like a lot of other regions that we've explored over the course of this chapter. You can kind of equate the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to the South Vietnamese in Vietnam. So, of course, the USSR, still trying to expand their influence, are going to invade and attempt to help the communists and put down the Mujahideen, and it basically begins another proxy conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union again. The US gives the Mujahideen weapons, Ultimately, again, you have the US and the USSR kind of fighting each other symbolically. Interestingly, the US government now, looking back with hindsight, gets a lot of criticism because they gave the Mujahideen weapons, and many members of this group, this organization, later became members of Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups. So many people look back kind of critically and they say that the US gave the Mujahideen weapons. Many of these weapons were later used against US soldiers during our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is really going to mark the end of détente, as the US again is on uneasy territory with the Soviet Union. So we're going to fast forward just a little bit. We are now in the administration of Jimmy Carter, former peanut farmer, then philanthropist and politician. You may not know this, you may, I'm not sure, but during the presidency of Richard Nixon, he's going to be forced to resign his role as president due to the Watergate scandal. Just kind of in summation, he had White House plumbers, agents travel to the Watergate Hotel, collect information via recordings of the Democratic Convention there to get information on his opponent. Because of the pressure put on him by his own Republican allies, he was forced to resign the presidency, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, became the next president. Because of the credibility gap in the government at this point, and basically everyone who was associated with Nixon's administration kind of being like dark marked, Gerald Ford was not well liked. He was seen as like a clumsy, buffoonish president by the press and the media, which really didn't help, which made him an easy opponent to defeat by Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter is going to attempt to sign SALT II, a continuation of SALT I with Brezhnev, in 1979. So he actually signs the actual treaty, but the problem is after the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, Congress refuses to ratify any document that would continue to ease tensions with them. Also in response, in 1980, Russia was scheduled to be holding the Olympic Games that year, and the US also is going to refuse to attend the Games as well. Just to show you a quick map, the United States has enormous influence in the world. They are going to implore other countries to also boycott the Olympics due to the situation in Afghanistan, and you'll see that in this map, the countries that are shaded in dark purple are not going to be attending that year. Interestingly, this is the opening ceremony of the 1980 Summer Olympic Games, and you can see in that giant display in the crowd, that is Vladimir Lenin, the father of communism, and you can see like cheerleaders on the field, or like a band on the field in the position of a hammer and sickle, another symbol of communism, further demonstrate that at this point, the Soviet Union is still very much promoting communist ideals. So we are now in the era of Reagan. Fast forwarding once again, Reagan is going to be an incredibly popular president, especially among conservatives. There are many people in our area who are very big fans of Reagan. If you watch anything with the Republican Party in modern day, where they're speaking favorably about the party in the past, it's usually during the era of Reagan and this return to like very conservative Christian values. So Reagan is going to be made president in 1980, mostly running as a fierce anti-communist candidate. Again, Jimmy Carter is going to be perceived as very weak. There's a saying in the press that gets circulated, ABC, anybody but Carter. This is also during a period of a lot of frustration because of the situation in the Middle East. Gasoline becomes very difficult to acquire, so people have to stand in line for hours just to get gas for their cars. And the anger in the public toward President Carter is going to make re-election very difficult for him. One of the most interesting parts of the Reagan presidency is his proposed Strategic Defense Initiative, which is going to be taking place a little bit into his presidency, but it's an important part, like in the context of our Cold War analysis. Basically, what the initiative is it's proposing laser beams be attached to satellites in outer space that could basically zap missiles out of the air and prevent them from actually hitting the United States. At this point, many people questioned Reagan's sanity. He was a very old president, so many people brought up issues like, does he have dementia? Is he not, mentally capable of being president? Other people, allies of the president, argue that he was really using this as a scare tactic, not as an actual plan. but rather kind of like something to spook the Soviet Union. Just to show you an infographic or a picture, this is what the Strategic Defense Initiative was supposed to do. It was nicknamed Star Wars by the press, but basically the idea is it was supposed to zap nuclear weapons out of the sky. So our last Soviet leader who we're going to talk about is Mikhail Gorbachev. So he's going to become the leader of the Soviet Union after Brezhnev's death. Much more forward-thinking in his policy making, and he introduces some new policies that you'll see are really going to cause the collapse of the Soviet Union. The first one is called glasnost, which translates roughly to openness. Think of like glass, transparency. And the components of this policy involved things like religious tolerance, the government being more honest or transparent with the public, the press being less censored, basically more freedoms for citizens, much more westernized. Number two, perestroika, which translates roughly to restructuring, involved opening up the Soviet economy, allowing some capitalist markets in, things that would not have sat very well with more traditional communist leaders of the past. Those who were very conservative in the Soviet Union were not happy with these policies whatsoever. They were much more westernized. Reagan is going to be very happy with these policies, so will the citizens of the US. And Gorbachev, you'll kind of see, is the person who's going to bring about the end of the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union. So just as we began our chapter by talking about the rising of the Berlin Wall and the symbolic divide that it really presented, we kind of end our chapter by talking about its literal and symbolic collapse. So this is what the Berlin Wall would have looked like. You can see on one side, people made a mockery of it. They spray painted it, graffitied on it, basically saying like how ridiculous it was that Germany was still split in half, still demonstrating this conflict between communism and capitalism. So by the late 1980s, East Germany was becoming much more tumultuous. People were beginning to escape into West Germany, which was perceived as being much better, like in terms of like the lives of citizens. People were digging tunnels out of East Germany. They were traveling on a rooftop. So the East German government really cracks down and they start shutting down their borders entirely, and mass demonstrations and mass protests are going to break out. Just as like a modern parallel, think of the racial protests that began in 2020 after the death of George Floyd all over the country. Think about how much impact and how quickly those escalated. In this case, it's even more dire, really pushing for immediate change. In 1987, President Reagan famously uttered his infamous line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And within 2 years, East Germany was forced to actually open up the wall and allow the East Germans to move into West Germany. They're hoping that this is going to save communism and prevent communism from being totally destroyed, but it does the total opposite. Once capitalist ideals are allowed into East Germany, they really overtake the country. Just to show you some photos, here are some images of people destroying the Berlin Wall. Many people have pieces of it in modern day as souvenirs. You may even know some people who do. Here are demonstrators on top of the Berlin Wall, and here you're seeing East German soldiers emerging from behind it, completely covered in graffiti and paint. So, with the wall coming down and the Iron Curtain officially kind of being destroyed, Germany is going to start moving toward reunification with the support of the world. And by 1990, Germany is officially really reunified as a capitalist country. And Germany today is one of the most powerful countries in the world, so it's really fascinating how we go from them being these, totalitarian regime in World War II to being divided into 4 quadrants, and then ultimately 2, East and West Germany, and then being reunified as a powerful country today. Over the course of the next decade, though, Germany had a ton of rebuilding to do. Here is a picture of the Berlin Wall, or a portion of it after it had been destroyed. It says, "Thank you, Gorby," on it, talking about Gorbachev and his policies that ultimately led to Germany falling to capitalism. So to really end us off, it's clear that Gorbachev's reforms were for the better of the people living in the Soviet Union, but they did ultimately cause the breakup of the USSR. Because power was less centralized and the totalitarian state was really not there anymore, many of the satellite states in the Soviet Union began demanding self-rule and independence from the Soviet government. Gorbachev was actually forced to resign toward the end of his time in power because of a coup d'etat began to emerge within the Soviet government of hardline communists who were attempting to overthrow him. Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia began declaring their independence and breaking away from the Soviet Union, and by 1991, all 15 of the republics within the USSR had splintered off and become their own countries. Just to wrap things up, this is what the map of the Soviet Union will look like during its collapse. Of course, the yellow is Russia as we know it today, and then all of those smaller colored nations would be the actual countries that are going to break off during its collapse. So this marks the end of the Cold War chapter. Many people have argued that we've actually entered into another sort of Cold War with Russia in modern day as we continue to engage in proxy conflicts in the Middle East and a lot of other regions as well, although others are hopeful that in the future relations between the two countries will start to improve.